We're continuing our series looking at questions that Jesus asked. And we're in Mark chapter 5 this morning. If you're looking on your phone or in an actual Bible, we're in Mark chapter 5 and the question of who touched me, who touched my clothes, beginning actually at verse 21. As usual, we're going to be raising some quite big questions that in reality we can't really do justice to on a Sunday morning. So there are on your chairs a takeaway sheet with some questions just to nudge you. Maybe when you've got a moment, either this afternoon or during the week, you can further reflect on it. And I encourage you to do so. I know, Terry, you had a real struggle with the takeaway sheet from last week. It clogged the filter on his tumble dryer, but that wasn't the intention of giving them out. But, I got very excited when Terry was telling me until he told me that. But there we are. Let's turn to Mark chapter 5, and says this. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him whilst he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" That account continues very excitingly, but we're focusing on that question that Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" And Father, as we do so, we want to thank you for the richness of your word. And I thank you for these stunning eyewitness accounts full of details that speaks of people being there, listening, watching these actual events unfolding. And as we read it some 2,000 years later, Father, may the power of what was happening then be made powerful in our ears and in our hearts as we read it today. May we have confidence that you do not change. And may you challenge us by the same question that Jesus asked then. for your glory. Amen. Well, Jesus' question comes in what is called, for those who like these techie things, a Markan sandwich. Because Mark very often puts together two accounts. We get a double whammy, as it were. And according to Mark, this was a very busy day for Jesus. It takes place in what is now northern Jordan. I've been there, real place. And Jesus is constantly being surrounded by crowds, which is why we find him getting off a boat, because way back in chapter 4, verse 35, they'd got onto a boat, he and his disciples, in order to escape the crowds. But now Jesus has barely set foot on the shore, and already word has got out, and crowds are beginning to form. And first up, the first half, as it were, of the sandwich is Jairus, who, despite the hostility of most of the Jewish leaders, Jairus comes to Jesus, because despite being a synagogue ruler, he begs Jesus to heal his daughter. A 12-year-old girl, we learn later, who is dying. And he falls at Jesus' feet to plead for her life. So initially, Jesus sets off to go to Jairus' house. But Jairus is not the only one to fall at Jesus' feet that day. Jesus' feet was a busy place. We might learn something from that. And Mark continues to stress the second time that a large crowd was pressing around Jesus. And you can imagine people jostling for a good view, people pressing in to try and catch what Jesus was saying as he was walking along the road towards Jairus' house. And a woman breaks cover and breaks into the story. And unlike Jairus, she isn't named. Later traditions vary. So Greek tradition says that she is Veronica. Ronnie. Who knows? Coptic traditions say she is Berenice. But actually, we do not know. What we do know is that she is desperate. She has unstoppable bleeding. And on the one hand, we aren't specifically told what is bleeding, but her actions indicate that this is a gynecological issue. And I'm very conscious I'm a bloke speaking this morning, but that is what we're talking about. She cannot stop bleeding. Medically, this was dire. She had once clearly been a woman of means, but over the past 12 years she has spent all that she once had on doctors whose primitive methods and procedures and prescriptions had probably contributed to making her worse, not better. Go to one of the museums with medical instruments that they've dug up at Pompeii, and it will make you shudder to think what has happened to this poor woman. And constant bleeding has probably left her tired, more and more exhausted. And her life must have been exhausting. This was way before feminine hygiene products. It must have been dominated by finding rags and washing rags and anything to stop her bleeding showing. But her village, her community, they'd have known. 12 years is an impossibly long time to keep that sort of a problem hidden, particularly with all her resources spent and gone. And in Old Testament law, a woman who was bleeding in that way was ritually unclean, which meant she was banned from entering the synagogue. If she went to Jerusalem, she couldn't set foot in the temple. And not only that, Jews had to keep away from her, because to touch her, even to sit where she had been sat, would have made you impure, unclean. You've had to stop everything and go and have a ritual wash to cleanse yourself. So the woman was a pariah. And it wasn't just Jews. In Greco-Roman world in which she was living, a menstruating woman was viewed as being harmful. She was socially unacceptable. As far as her world was concerned, she was a contaminant. She was pollution on two legs. So, if you are that woman, what are you feeling when you approach that crowd with Jesus in the midst of it? No wrong answers, just wondering. What are you feeling as you approach that crowd with Jesus in the middle of it? Any suggestions? Desperate? Fear? Loneliness? Humiliation? Anything else? Difficult to get to Jesus. All of this, I reckon, probably say much more. And it's hardly surprising, I think, that when she learns that Jesus is around, she goes to seek him out. She must have heard that he heals even lepers. But probably some of her community have also gone to see Jesus. So she risks being identified. She risks being recognized. She risks being forced away from anywhere near the crowd, let alone before she gets anywhere near Jesus. So I think her approach must have been painstakingly careful. She probably covered her head in such way. I can imagine in my mind's eye her approaching almost crouched over. And when she's on the edge of that crowd, she goes in almost bent over because she doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be recognized. And maybe by the time that she reaches where Jesus is talking, she's, as that wonderful picture indicates, probably on all fours as she listens to the men above her talking to Jesus. She is scrabbling around in the dust to avoid being trodden on and trying to keep up with Jesus. And finally, this brave, courageous woman reaches out and just touches the hem of his coat. And we might think, well, why did she just grab his coat? Why doesn't she kind of touch him or try to grab his hand or something? Well, this is a woman who is terrified of attracting attention. And coupled with that, popular folklore was that someone's clothes also contained the power of a person. And as you read Mark's Gospel, people are always trying to touch Jesus. In Mark chapter 6, someone else tries to even just touch the hem of his coat. It was a popular belief. You just had to touch someone's clothing. And she does so. And something happens. She physically felt something immediately happen. Whatever that sensation was, it must have been extraordinary. But she cannot shout, she cannot scream with delight because she still wants to stay completely anonymous. She knows what has happened, but no one else will, and she'll be named and shamed and blamed for making them all unclean. But she isn't the only one to know something has happened. It stops Jesus in his tracks. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. Mark is the only gospel writer to tell us that detail. And when I've been reflecting, I can sort of relate to it, because I don't know if you've ever been in a situation putting a hand on someone and praying for healing for them. But I know in a number of situations where I've been in doing that in the past, as I've been praying for healing, I have felt a very strange warmth in my hand. That's very often happened when I prayed for healing. I know that that's not unique to me, but it makes me think, well, if I feel that when I'm praying for healing, I can only imagine how much more true that will be of Jesus. I wasn't the one being healed. I was praying for someone else being healed. But even I could feel power happening, something warm happening. And then Jesus asks the question, who touched my clothes? And Jesus' disciples, so they look at one another and they stare at him with wide-eyed astonishment. There must have been a hint of ridicule as they patronizingly point out the number of people around and say, and yet you can ask, who touched your clothes? Who touched you? This was tantamount to asking, who touched me in a rugby scrum? It was ridiculous on one level. Now, I wonder, if you were that woman at that point in time, what would you be feeling when you heard Jesus say, "Who touched my clothes?" What would you be feeling then? Others would be looking at her. Frightened. Amazed and frightened. Guilt. Anything else? There's no wrong answers here. Joy. What a weird combination. What a weird combination. My sense is that, it's only a sense, but that she's instantly swamped by another feeling. Her elation, I suspect, was still there, but more and more it was swamped by panic. She wills Jesus just to start walking again. Why is he wanting to publicly humiliate her? She's probably praying, "No, please don't show me up. Please don't show me up. Please don't show me up." But Jesus doesn't start walking. And now the crowd isn't on the move. Her presence becomes more and more obvious. People will have noticed her by now. So she owns up. And she hasn't got, I think, very far to go, but she falls at his feet. She is terrified. She is, we're told, physically trembling. This is the worst of all her fears come true. Would he be so outraged that he takes her healing away? Would she end up humiliated and still bleeding? Maybe she's just feeling, why did I ever think this was a good idea? And there she is, scrabbling in the dust, falling at his feet, trembling. She's got nothing to lose, literally nothing to lose. In for a penny, in for a pound, she pours out the whole truth. And Jesus, I can't read this without imagining in my mind, because of what else we know of Jesus, I can't imagine him not putting a hand on her in some shape or form. He must have just shown his compassion to this petrified woman. Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace," in shalom, that's the word, "and be freed from your suffering." Now, we might think, well, the moment she was healed, she was free from suffering, she would have gone home at that moment in time, full of peace, experiencing more shalom that she'd known for years. What is the point of Jesus putting her through something else by asking her to reveal herself? Well, for Jesus, that wasn't an option. Because to do that will be to let her just wander off, believing her folk religion in touching a healer's clothes had magically healed her. Whereas it was her faith, not in a cloak, but in who was wearing it, that was the thing that had healed her. She had to know that Jesus had healed her, not some mystical hocus pocus. And Jesus was and is all about relationship and relationships. There is no secret, private deal with Jesus. When we commit to him, he expects us to commit to his family. He expects us to be part of his community. Letting her sneak a healing from him and then sneak off back home, nothing said, no conversation, no interaction. That just was not the Jesus way. Jesus was and is never about some sort of vending machine. What he was offering was not an automated get healed quick scheme. For her to truly know shalom in all its fullness, something more was needed. So because Jesus calls her out, because she sees him look at her, speaks to her, she leaves knowing that he who healed her knows her and cares for her. She begins in that moment to know, after 12 years of dehumanizing isolation, that she is worth taking time with, that she is worth speaking with. Jesus in that moment gives her a dignity she hasn't had for over a decade, a healing way beyond stopping the bleeding. But the thing about Jesus' question, who touched me, who touched my clothes, the thing that hits me is that by asking the question, we are in effect being told that not everyone was. Not everyone around him was trying to touch him or his clothes. And when I thought about it, I just couldn't get over that. That's really bothered me. And I've ended up thinking, why wasn't everyone trying to touch him? I mean, had I been there, whether I knew that I needed healing or not, I think I'd have wanted to have touched him. I mean, this man had healed lepers. He's been delivering people of demons. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? You could only gain by touching Jesus if you have the opportunity. Why wouldn't you touch Jesus? But there were clearly people in that crowd who were both crowding around Jesus and yet keeping their distance from him. People at that moment could have honestly put their hands up and said, well, it wasn't me. And what stirs in me is that hope that had I been there, I would not have been one of them. And I wonder whether in churches, in this church, whether we gather as a crowd, but some of us are keeping our distance. We want to be with Jesus, but we're not wanting to touch Jesus. Not wanting, either in a crowd or in our own space, as it were, to tell him the whole truth about us, to reveal ourselves to him. We may be near one another, but we're nowhere near telling Jesus, let alone anyone else, about the whole truth of our lives, our own need, perhaps, of healing. As a Baptist minister for some 22 years, I've had some incredible conversations. The real privilege of people telling me the truth about their lives. The drinking, the pornography, that they've been unfaithful to their wife or to their husband, that they've committed a crime, that they've hit their girlfriend. If the walls of my office could talk. Highly privileged conversations. And I know that in most, if not all of those conversations, when truth has been painfully, and it has been, painfully shared, truth that people felt ashamed of, truth they felt made them unclean, impure, when that truth has been shared, healing, shalom, has begun to come. One Sunday evening, some 9 years ago, I was in my kitchen at Elm Road cooking for a group of young people who were about to arrive any moment for a discussion group. And I was stirring a large pot of chili con carne. I can see it in my mind's eye now. And Simon Plank, bless him, burst through the door, having brought his son Sam to the group, and he said in characteristic style, "How's it going, buddy?" And at that moment, I burst into tears. I had not known that I was about to burst into tears, but I did because suddenly I couldn't answer the question. And when I tried, I found myself talking about all the stuff I'd had to do that past week, all the stuff I had to do in the week to come. And I suddenly heard someone completely overwhelmed, talking in a way I didn't recognize, but I knew was me, and suddenly I knew it was true. And somehow I led that discussion evening, and then I went and saw two close friends, they knew who they are, and told them what had happened and how I felt, and how now I thought about it, it hadn't been the first time, and I didn't know when it would happen again, and I felt out of control. And they told me to phone the doctors first thing on Monday to say that I had a mental health issue. So I phoned the doctor and I said, I've been told to tell you I have a mental health issue. And I saw a doctor that morning. In fact, I saw him twice. Such was my concern about me at that moment in time. And he told me that I needed to tell the deacons that I would be off work for at least 2 weeks. So I remember that evening I called an emergency deacons meeting. And I spent the rest of the day weirdly just thinking, reflecting and crying and realizing a whole raft of possible reasons why I was feeling this way, and all the more just knowing I was not in control. Something was broken inside. And I met with the deacons that evening and told them what was going on, and they were brilliant. And so very firm. They basically lifted every responsibility from me. They emptied my diary. I was to rest for at least 2 weeks, and I would tell them how my next doctor's visit went. And when they left me sitting in my office, I remember sitting there for ages. And in that moment, I didn't know whether I would ever minister again. I just didn't have it in me at all. But each of those conversations with Simon, with those friends, with the doctor, with the deacons, in which I shared my truth, was incredibly painful, embarrassing even, because I'd been raised, as I'm sure most of us have been, to carry on. 5 years at public school had drilled into me, you do not buckle. I'd ministered to people with mental health issues, but now it was happening to me. I felt incredibly vulnerable talking about it, finding the language to admit it, having to be honest about it, honest about the truth. And what I'm trying to say is possibly to anyone who right now is dying inside at the thought of telling Jesus the whole truth. Withering inside at the thought of reaching out to touch Jesus for healing of this or of that because you feel too ashamed, too unacceptable. What I'm trying to say, that at least in a small way, I get it. I know that moment. And much more importantly, Hebrews 4 verse 15 tells us that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Some 6 weeks later, I slowly returned to my role with a shalom I hadn't known for ages. I just wonder what peace, what shalom, what healing might you be missing out on because you're not reaching out to touch Jesus, sharing your whole truth with him. What encourages me here is that Jesus allows ministry to a ritually unclean woman to interrupt him healing the child of a synagogue leader. And it's not a minor interruption. The child dies. Jesus has to raise her from the dead. So this is a major interruption. Normally you would say, well, no one died. Someone did. It doesn't get much bigger than this. But Jesus does not condemn or criticize the woman for doing what she does. You can interrupt Jesus. And in a way, he was waiting, available for interruption. In fact, these interruptions were Jesus' ministry. He came to serve and to seek and to save. He is looking for exactly these opportunities to do so. And he shows her enormous compassion. I'm struck that elsewhere he calls ladies who come to him woman. And here Jesus calls this woman daughter. He is telling her that she has a heavenly Father, And his actions are telling her that that Heavenly Father loves her, does not reject her, is not recoiling from her, is not revolted by her, but cares for her and wants her to know the fullness of his shalom, his peace.